There we have got a story for you today coming from the book of Acts. Now, this story wraps up the book of Acts, and it's the last of the historical lessons that are in the New Testament because after this, we go into the epistles and a few other things, and we'll talk about those later. But for now, we are wrapping up the story of Paul's travels as far as we know them. And as you may remember from earlier lessons, Paul had been arrested because he was a Roman citizen. He was able to appeal to Caesar, which meant that he didn't have to go through his trial back in Judea or anywhere in that area. He was able to go to Rome and appeal to Caesar or to one of the people Caesar would appoint to handle it. In any event, he was having to go, and a number of his friends were going with him, and this kind of thing was allowed during that time. Now, of course, they had no planes, no trains, and the ships they had were sailing ships for the most part. There were some that could be rowed, but really, this was not the way you would travel long distance. So, getting from Judea or the city of Caesarea, where he was at the time, to Rome meant getting on a ship. And you would think, okay, that shouldn't be that hard to do, even though it meant sailing. But the problem here was that you had to find a ship that was going the way you wanted to go because they didn't just have passenger ships. What they had were cargo ships, and you would have to find one of those that was going in your direction and taking that ship. And because they were cargo ships, and usually they were shipping things back to Rome, then they would often have several stops to make as they were making their way to Rome. So this could get kind of complicated. Another thing that complicated it was the weather because there were certain times of the year when you could sail and it really wasn't a problem. Other times of the year, well, we'll find out as we go along in this lesson. So for this, I have a map to show you of this area. And Paul was down around here. There's Caesarea, and all of this kind of light blue is the Mediterranean Sea. And where he needs to get to is Rome, which is up here in Italy. It's now called Italy. At the time, it was just part of the Roman Empire, and there were different provinces all through this area that belonged to Rome. So he's down here, and this is many hundreds of miles to go, especially when you consider that you didn't just make a straight line, because often the ships were small. They would be the kind that would go along the coast and they would pick up people and cargo along the way, and then they would stop in another place. Some of the people would get off, some of the cargo would come off, more cargo would come on. So it would be a slow process to get back to Rome. Now, Paul had some friends with him, but there were also Romans on board, and they were there for the prisoners who were being taken to Rome. Because Paul was not the only one headed to Rome as a prisoner. But at the start of the trip, there was a centurion who liked Paul. So as they went up the coast and they stopped in Sidon, um, there were church members who came there, and the centurion allowed Paul to stay with those church members, and they were able to feed him and take care of him and visit with him until it was time for the ship to go again. Now, the first ship they went on was one of these kind of slow, stop in every port kind of ships, and it made its way up along the coast of Asia Minor and it got up into this area. Well, there was a bigger ship, and this one was heading to Rome. And it seems that this time the centurion who liked Paul got them onto the ship with a different centurion, and he was going to go back to where he came from because he is not mentioned again. There's a different centurion who's mentioned from here, and he doesn't like Paul as much. Well, they start heading south, and you see this island is named Crete. Well, the winds were already starting to change as they were getting into the season where you did not want to be sailing. And they could not get to where they wanted to go, and they ended up on the south side of Crete. Now, normally they would go along the north side of Crete, a little more direct and a better route to take overall. Well, they ended up on the south side, and there was this place called Fair Havens. Now it's getting close to winter time, and Paul is saying, I don't think we should be going any farther. Um, but the captain of the ship and the owner of the ship and some of the sailors didn't like the idea of Fair Havens because it was not a good place to stay over the winter. And so they decided to go for this place on the west end, which was a better port. They started out for that on a day where the wind was coming from the south, everything looked good, but then bam, a storm hits. And you see a line that's supposed to show the way they went. The fact is, we don't know exactly how they got across this area because this was called a northeaster or nor'easter is has been said because there are two air masses, and this is known nowadays, that come in at this time of year and they hit each other and they cause whirling clouds. So think of trying to sail in a ship in a hurricane. And this is what they've got. Well, the sailors are even scared in this one. And the way they knew their way back then, if they didn't go along the coast, they had to use something called celestial navigation. And that means where you see the stars at night and you go by the sun during the day, and you can figure out kind of where you are and which direction you're going. Well, in a hurricane, there are clouds everywhere, day and night. They don't know where they are. And they're afraid they're going to run aground somewhere. And if they do, that's bad news because it means the ship is likely to break up. Well, they start throwing cargo overboard and they throw some of the tackle from the ship. And this is all important stuff that they really didn't want to lose. But the alternative is the ship breaking up and everybody dying. So they do this. And they even take ropes and wrap them around the hull of the ship so it won't break up. And they're moving along for about 2 weeks. This is going on, and everybody's scared. And something good happens in this. Um, Paul goes to the leaders of the ship and says, okay, you didn't listen to me. I've got something to tell you. An angel came to me and told me that we're going to survive this. The ship is going to be lost, but you've got to do what I say to do. And at this point, after a couple of weeks, they're finally ready to listen to him. They didn't listen to him before, but they're listening to him now. And he has everybody eat what they can of the grain that's left before they throw it overboard. Then they take a sail in the front, a small sail for steering, and then anchors in the back. And that's so that they can keep the ship pointed the way they want it to go. And they let the rudder back into the water. So they're doing all this so they can steer it. And they're thinking, okay, if we can get into a harbor somewhere in here, we can run aground and we'll be okay. Well, the sailors start to sense that they're getting close to land and they start taking measurements and realizing they're moving quickly toward this land. Of course, they have uh, anchors out, what you call a sea anchor, and that's sort of think of like a parachute on the back of a car that would slow it down. You see this in drag races sometimes, and that's what the sea anchor does with the ship. It kind of slows it down, and even so, they hit a sandbar before they get to the beach. And so the front end of the ship is stuck, and then the waves are crashing into the back end and start breaking up the ship. Well, soldiers on board with the centurions are wanting to kill the prisoners because you may remember that if soldiers or guards let somebody get away, then they end up being killed for letting them get away. Well, the centurion at this point, who's in charge of the soldiers, decides to trust Paul, and he tells the soldiers not to kill anybody. And Paul is saying, okay, those of you who can swim, swim. Everybody else grab something that floats until you get to shore, and we'll all make it. Well, it turns out that they do. Everybody makes it to shore. Now, this is a ship that had close to 300 people on it, so it's a big ship, but it breaks up. Well, they find out. Of course, they're wet and they're cold because, as I said, this is close to winter time, and they're trying to start a fire, and they find out they are on the island of Malta. Now, Malta is right here. It's a small island south of Sicily, which is around the end of Italy now. And Sicily is actually part of Italy now. Malta is its own independent country these days. But at this time, it was all under Rome's control. There are people there who don't speak Greek, but they're ones who live in this area, even though the Romans are in charge of this place too. And um, they're starting a fire to warm everyone up and dry them out. And these people see something happen. Now, Paul gathers up some brush to throw onto the fire to get it going. Well, there's a snake in the brush, and that snake latches itself on Paul's hand. And these people are talking to themselves, saying, "Uh huh." Now we see what happens because he escaped from the sea, but he must be a bad guy because he has gotten bitten by a snake. And so justice is having its way with him. Well, Paul doesn't pay much attention to the snake. He shakes his hand over the fire and drops the snake into the fire. And they're keeping on waiting for him to suddenly drop dead or to swell up or something. Nothing happens to him. The poison in the snake doesn't hurt him. So then they go and they say, "Oh, he must be a god." Well, this kind of thing has happened before when Paul has done things or miraculous things have happened concerning Paul. And he, I guess, brushes all that off because he doesn't claim to be anything special. But what happens next is pretty cool because there's a head guy on the island, and we're not sure if he's officially in charge of everything or if he's just a rich person. Everyone looks to him. Exactly what his role is, but he invites everyone to stay at his place, or at least Paul and his friends, and he has food for them, and they're able to stay there uh, for the next 3 months. Well, the cool thing that happens is this man's father is real sick with a fever and he's got intestinal problems, and I'll let your parents explain that to you. But there was something called Malta fever that people would have back in those days if they drank milk that was somehow tainted. And that's what this guy had. And Paul goes and prays for him, and the man's father gets well. Well, word gets around then, and people are bringing sick friends and relatives to Paul, and he's healing them as well. So you see, during this time, Paul is not thinking, "Oh, I've just got to get to Rome and talk about Jesus when I get there." He's helping people all along as he goes. Now, he eventually does get to Rome, and he's able to speak to the Jewish leaders first, and he's placed into a house. And even though he's under guard as he's waiting for his trial, people are able to come and visit him. He meets other Christians, ones he hadn't seen before, and he is now where God had told him he was going to be. So that's how the book of Acts wraps up. And I will show you for this one is a ship that I've got from my tie as we remember the shipwreck of Paul. And remember, through all of this, he was focused on doing God's work wherever he was. With that, I will let you go, and I'll hope to see you next time. Bye.